Hello, Renegade Thinkers. Today's podcast episode comes from a live show we aired back in June with Cmo Huddlers Khalid Khatib of Stack Overflow, Ellina Shinnick of Hub International, and Mike Brannan of Centric Consulting. The entire show focused on the hybrid workplace and the hybrid world that we're living in now. And we've been living in it for 18 months. And as far as I can tell, it looks like it's here to stay, which is going to be a challenge for every leader when you have some employees in, some employees across the country, maybe even around the world. This episode is a lesson in what it means to be a leader, namely to be deliberate and transparent and lead by example and be flexible as the state of things change each and every day. And we know, as we talk about in my new book, Renegade Marketing, 12 Steps to Building Unbeatable B2B Brands, having your employees behind you is essential for success in marketing. So let's get to the show. I know you're going to enjoy it. Again, I'm your host, Drew Neiser, live from my home studio in New York City. In less than 18 months, the notion of work as location has been turned on its head. An April 2021 survey of remote workers by Flex Jobs noted that 65% want to keep working from home and 58% would look for a new job if forced to return to the office full time. Roughly 1/3 named the hybrid model combining office and remote work as their preference. So if you take one thing away from this show, there will be no return to normalcy when it comes to desk workers, where your employees' work has changed perhaps forever, and the implications for companies, leaders, and marketers are really colossal. Most likely it will change how you recruit, where you recruit from, how you lead, how you build culture, how you collaborate, and basically how you do business. That's a lot of change to deal with at once, which is why there's no time like the present to figure this out. And to help you do just that, we have three super savvy CMOs as guests today, starting first with Khalid Khatib, who is the Senior Vice President of Marketing at Stack Overflow and the star of episode 181 of Renegade Thinkers Unite. Hey, Khalid, how are you?
Hey, Drew. Good afternoon. Doing great. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's great. And, when you and I spoke back in 2020, it was right after the lockdown. And you guys had already sort of been through a little bit of this, but were you at all surprised at how so many companies were able to make work from home work for them?
No, I mean, I yes and no, right? I think there were lots of things about 2020 that were surprising, and it's tough to sort of remember the conversation that we had in March of 2020 because everything was sort of spiraling out of control at that moment. That said, I think that humans are highly adaptable, and we've seen that play out over the last 18 months or so. And so, I don't think that this has been sort of like black and white shift to remote work. I think it's accelerated things that were already happening. There were certain industries, consulting, for example, where hoteling and hybrid work, especially on Fridays, was already happening. My company was 40-50% remote prior to the pandemic. And I think, if you had asked people in February of 2020, do you at least know someone who is working remote or has a hybrid situation? They would say yes. So I don't think the concept was entirely foreign to people. And that sort of, muscle that was built up over the last year just sort of, took a little bit of finessing.
It's funny as you're talking about that, I think that's true. But, one of the things that I wondered about early on, having not had a work from home, I mean, we had people that were, all over the world working for Renegade, but I was still worried about collaboration, particularly when it came to creative. And, that was sort of one of the great, wonderful surprises is that we figured it out. How has your thinking evolved? Because you were 40 or 50%, then you must have gone 100%. How is it evolving now as most of this country at least is opening up?
Sure. Yeah. So we continue to be 100% remote. And I think like most folks, we've seen people who were previously allocated to our New York office or to London, for example, move elsewhere, whether that's upstate New York or a city like Raleigh or Savannah, Georgia, where we're seeing a lot of folks migrate. And so we do plan on going back to a hybrid remote environment for those who want it starting in September, and sort of increasing the options to go back into an office from there. That said, I think we don't know what we don't know. And if there's one thing that I think companies have learned over the last 18 months or so, it's that, and I think it's been compounded by this hyper competitive hiring landscape that we're in today. They need to listen to their employees. And we're making a real concerted, I think we always have. And long before I started at the company, there's been a culture of sort of collaboration and communication, but asking folks, what do you want to do? What makes you comfortable? And which environment are you most productive? And let's go from there. Because we've seen, especially at some larger tech companies, where they've cascaded a policy that's turned out to be incredibly unpopular. Folks have not said, I don't like this, but I'll do it. They said, I don't like this, I'm leaving. And then we've seen companies backtrack.
So as I'm thinking about this, I'm wondering, why do companies so you've now made it work for 100% remote. Why do you need to go back to the office? Why do you need any employees to do that?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think every company is different, and so is every culture. And I think every team dynamic is different as well. I think the other thing that's worth keeping in mind is one of the reasons that remote work worked over the last 16 months or so is there was the shared experience of the pandemic, or the collective trauma of the pandemic, however you want to think about it. And so we were all going through the same thing. That is no longer the case. Every region is sort of experiencing the ongoing pandemic differently. Every company certainly as well. The other thing that I think is worth mentioning is that different teams are better at remote work than others. And so oftentimes a company will have a remote culture within the engineering team or a product team, and sales will often be in the office every day. They want to meet with customers. They have a highly collaborative culture. SDRs is an even better example, where they tend to be younger. Sometimes they're not as productive at home. They're more likely to live with roommates, for example. And I think every company, through both data and anecdotal feedback, is going to have to figure out on their own which teams are best positioned for remote work and who should come back into the office. And not only, I think that you have to sort of say, what does productivity look like, and how do we track it against these things?
Yeah, and I think it's so interesting because you would think that all the salespeople would want to come back. You would think that they would be more productive in the office, that they would feed on it. But what are you going to do when you have a salesperson or an SDR who is a holdout? These are some questions that we really haven't had a chance to sort of wrestle with. And then, the other thing that I just sort of feel bad for so many folks that are just getting started in their companies. I mean, when I first moved to New York 100 years ago, the company was your social life. We went out all the time. I mean, JWT had a bar on the 4th floor called the company store. That was where you started your weekend. What's going to happen when particularly when these folks decide, well, I don't want to commute, but now I don't have a social life?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'm probably too old to effectively answer it. But I do think it goes back to this notion of adaptability. I'm still in New York. I'm in Brooklyn, and what I've seen over the last 3 weeks, this is the most social summer ever. It very much reminds me of when I moved to New York prior to social media, when we were all BBMing what we were going to do. Everyone is out. So I don't anticipate that people will have a difficult time forming social bonds outside of work. Right. I do think it's a fair point that, you don't feel as close to I think it's a double-edged sword, right? Like, I think we both learned that sometimes having a bar in your advertising shop, which I did too, it's not a good idea. So maybe some of that going away is an okay thing. But I do think that every company, even if you do elect to go fully remote moving forward, you have to plan for some sort of in-person meetup, whether that's team specific or company specific, because there is work that needs to be done face to face.
Okay. All right. Awesome. Let's bring in Ellina Shinnick, who is the CMO of Hub International. Hi, Ellina.
Hi, Drew.
How are you? Where are you, first of all?
I'm well. Actually, I'm in Chicago, and I'm in the office today for the very first time since March of 2020. There was a meeting, and we felt comfortable meeting. We just formed a new team, and many people, probably 40% of the team, was hired during the pandemic, and we had never met in person, but for being screens or tiles on the Zoom screen. So it's a interesting day to be having this conversation.
Oh, that's amazing. And of course, it means that you have a nice high-speed connection too. And so was there any trepidation? How many people were back, and were you all in a conference room together, for example?
So this was voluntary.
Right.
Hub is very thoughtful. So first of all, just to take a step back, we're in the U.S. and Canada, and right now we will be opening offices for the majority of offices throughout the country on July 12th with a voluntary return to office, really kind of approach through the summer, right through Labor Day weekend. And so it's very much enabling teams to slowly reintegrate into the office as they are comfortable, right, as they feel safe to do so. So anything that we're doing this summer is completely voluntary, and employees and teammates are just coming in only if they feel safe to do so, and following all of the safety protocols in the specific regions, in the office buildings, just being very cautious.
Interesting. And so, but that's earlier than I've heard. And of course, it's voluntary. Well, it'll be fascinating to see how many people start to show up. All right. Well, and let's start with you. Do you see yourself going back into the office regularly?
I will be. I'm certainly not going to go. I'm likely not going to be in, 100. It's going to be an evolution. But I will say, I was in today for the very first time. I had an opportunity to physically, in a safe way, reconnect with colleagues who I've worked with for a long time, and who I've continued to work with very closely throughout the pandemic on Zoom. And so in many ways, while we never skipped a beat, it was really wonderful to see them. And it was really wonderful to meet some of the new teammates, like I said, that have joined during the pandemic that we've never met in person. And it just kind of gave a jolt of energy. And, and that's why I think there's this beauty in hybrid, right? There's absolutely critical periods of time when people are heads down and doing work, and they should be able to do that in a space, on my team anyhow, that is the best for them, right? Whatever their quiet space is, their most productive space is. But, just kind of getting together and having that energy and seeing one another, I didn't actually realize in many ways how much I missed it, right? Because we just adapted, right? To Khalid's point, like, in the thick of COVID, we have to get work done. We have to make it work. And so you're like, this is great. This is all working. And now you're kind of back and you're like, wow, I really miss the energy that you feel, right, from seeing people.
Yeah, and I really, it's funny, we had an outing of the Renegade team last week, and none of us has seen each other really since March 2020. And it was just great, and we had all been vaccinated, and we, all hugged it out. And it was lovely. And because all of us are sort of reacquainting ourselves with all of our friends and all of our workmates, there is this moment. I wonder again how it'll be. And, as we move forward, is it just a question of, if we see each other every 3 months, we can sort of have that feeling of connection, or is there going to be a competitive advantage by having your team back in the office, working and seeing each other on a regular basis? I think this is one of those this critical moment that is, with a big team like you have. I imagine you're thinking about that, and which will be, can it really be on an individual by individual basis?
I think the answer is it remains to be seen, right? The company is moving towards a hybrid model, right? What's wonderful is that the leadership team and the executive management team is listening to employees and is really adjusting to kind of where the world is going, right? What our employees are saying. So I don't know that I have the answer today, and I don't know that I'll have the answer at the end of July. I've heard from my team that they want a hybrid model because there's value in the flexibility. It's what they've become accustomed to over the last 15 months. I completely understand that. There's also value in being able to just be heads down and work in an environment that doesn't have distractions. And maybe that's your home, but some people prefer to come into the office more often. What that will look like in terms of competitive advantage, I think we're going to have to work out those kinks. I think when people come back kind of like what I felt today and get re-energized, that will create a spark. Does that mean we have to do it every 3 months or on some other cadence? It's kind of almost probably a project by project basis as well.
Yeah, it's going to be so interesting. All right, well, let's bring in Mike Brannan, the VP of Technology and Marketing at Centric Consulting. Hi, Mike.
Hi, Drew.
Good to see you. And Centric has been a fully remote, or as you guys call it, a virtual company, pretty much from the get-go, which again puts you way ahead of the curve. And you and I've talked with your boss, the CEO, even wrote a book on the topic. Can you talk a little bit about the setup at Centric when it comes to remote work? I mean, this is just the way you've always done it. So give us a sense of that structure.
Correct, Drew. And, we're a professional services firm, so our consultants spend the vast majority of their time at client sites. And so, from the very beginning, we've been, a hybrid work model or a remote work model. And, we focused on being digitally enabled from the very beginning. So all of our kind of core business processes, whether it's filling out a timesheet or onboarding an employee or offboarding an employee, we've thought about that digitally from the very beginning. So, it starts with kind of digitally enabling all your core business functions, right? The other thing, about 3 years ago, we rolled out Teams, Microsoft Teams. And if you don't use Teams, it's a Slack-like project. So we have a very good approach to various channels that empower our various operating groups. And so Teams has been really, really key. It includes IM, email, calendaring, all that good stuff. And then the last thing, and this is maybe a tad bit subtle, right, is when you're remote, especially, fully remote like we have been, it's really important to define your culture, right? And, that can be a squishy thing, right? But it starts out at the top with your kind of core values and who you are as a company. And it gets all the way down to like, are you or are you not going to be okay with what seems like silly things like letting people move the laundry along or taking a call while they're walking, right? And then, making sure as an organization, you're really aligned on that culture because it kind of empowers how you operate and how you are and what's okay and what's not okay as a remote company.
The culture point is really a great one. And I want to get into that a little later on. So I will circle back to that because there are a couple of things that I want to talk about culture, because we've got the culture that we need to retain employees. We've got the culture that we need to recruit employees. And but we don't have the physical office to do it, which is such a part of it. So we'll get back to that. So what do you see? So what's interesting here is in your model, the physical contact that your employees got was with a client, right? They were at least physically there, but they, for the last year and a half, have not even had that. They've had to learn to do that. So, and your customers have gotten used to that. Do you see, and do your consultants imagine going back to physically being on site? One, because it's just, again, it's nice to see people, or are they going to be in their cubbies at home?
That's a great question. And the answer is kind of subtle, right? Because as a consulting company, if you don't have your client needs paramount at the very top of whatever you're doing, it's going to be a problem. And some of our customers are okay with remaining remote. Other customers have said, hey, we want your folks back into the office. And so what we are trying to do is going through literally all of our people and saying, what's your preference? What are you comfortable with? Are you okay with going back in? And if they're not, we're trying to accommodate them to the greatest extent possible. I will echo what the other CMOs on the call have said. We're seeing our clients, greater than 50% are embracing some kind of a hybrid model. And if we have a consultant that doesn't want to go back, we're going to try to move them to another client because, again, people are not saying, I don't want to go back. I'm okay with it. Our folks are saying, if I can't be remote, if I choose to be, I'm going to quit and go elsewhere. And that is what our customers are telling us as well. Our clients are, if we have a client that says, hey, we're going fully back into the office and that's the end of that, we say, well, good luck with that, but I hope you got a good recruiting function because you're going to need it.
Yeah, as an advisor to them, but also it puts your company in an interesting situation, because if you have a consultant that doesn't want to go on site and the customer wants you to go on site, that's when it's going to really get interesting, because you're probably going to want to, you don't want to lose the client.
Yeah, and we have some flexibility, right, to move our people around. In a lot of cases, that's possible. So we're probably in a special situation there. We can try to accommodate the employee. We have not yet come to a place where it loggerheads with an individual about, I will not go back, and we don't have anywhere else to put them.
So
we'll see.
I remember in Larry's book, it's Larry English is the CEO of Centric. He talked a lot about some of the things that you did to sort of bring people together. Is this some of that stuff that you used to do? Are you starting to do those kinds of things?
Yeah, absolutely. We have our tradition, our rhythm is to have 3 in-person meetings a year for the entire company. So we'll bring everybody together 3 times a year. That's our standard way we've rolled. And our first in-person meeting is September. But then I would say, we as a company during the pandemic have been doing the same kinds of things most companies have been doing: virtual happy hours, virtual games. Our teams, our various operating groups typically have weekly meetings where we vary the agenda from being, completely serious about business topics to being completely light and, three truths and a lie and that kind of stuff. Yeah. Yep.
It's so, the 3 in-person meetings and the media, when I hear that, the first thing I want to know is, are you making sure, does everybody have to be vaccinated to be able to come?
We as consult for our company, no, we're not mandating vaccinations. For our customers, we follow the customer's guides. So of course, if the customers say, hey, to come back on site, you need to be vaccinated, we adopt their policies.
Interesting. Very interesting. All right. Cool. Wow. So many different questions that I have for the whole group. Let's bring everybody back. And let's talk about this culture and what it means. And so there's a couple aspects of this that are going through my mind that may or may not be actually the same topic. One is this notion of, how do you, particularly at startups in the tech world, the office was such an important part. It was the hub where people came together, and you'd have your playthings, your ping pong tables in your bars or whatever. And that was part of the culture of getting people to connect and talk. That was part one. And then part 2 of culture is sort of the values of the company and how you reinforce those when you don't get to see physically the bosses and the other people exhibiting these things in real time. And then sort of number 3 of this culture thing is, you're no longer recruiting for culture fit, you're recruiting for culture add. So I've really sort of thrown in wildcards that may or may not be on the same topic. But now we're going to talk about this hybrid situation where we're going to have some people in the office, some people at home. And I'm just curious if you guys have started to think about culture in the context of that mess I just threw out there. I know, Khalid, you will have thoughts on this.
Yeah, I do have thoughts. I think a couple of things especially come to mind. One, I think that values are super important. They should be rather aspirational, but you should always be able to ground what you're doing in them. And I think one thing that has to shine through in your values, your communication style, and your culture is authenticity. I think one of the really positive aspects of the last 18 months or so is that people were more vulnerable than they've ever been before in a work context. If they were struggling, they often said so. If they were dealing with personal issues, they were not afraid to air them out. I think that I want that to continue to play out. And I think, other sort of macro things happened at the same time. tough conversations around racial equity, non-optical allyship, and I'd hope for those to continue as well. So I think that this sort of authentic communication style, whether you're fully in the office, remote, or hybrid, should be ingrained in everyone's culture, because it's an expectation that especially younger workers will now have. The other thing in terms of hiring people, I think that culture fit was always sort of a sort of fake thing, a false flag. I think that I'm excited to see that go away. I think that it should always be culture ad. And that we need to think much more holistically about who we're bringing into the company and what they can bring to the table. And I hope that we're sort of democratizing opportunity by going through what we're going through now.
So we can separate, and maybe Ellina, you can weigh in on this. We can separate culture and things that we do to build culture from physical office. We've done that now for 6. So let's sort of go down that theme and talk about what does that mean and how do we reinforce that?
Sure. So, for me, and this is where I think hybrid is, everything remains to be seen in many ways, but this is the value of hybrid, right? And having that connectivity, because I do think there's a place and time, and just going back to some of the things you said in the beginning of this show, Drew, right? Especially for younger people, and whether that's culture or just modeling behavior or any kind of training, right? With more intangible things, that's where I think this hybrid model really starts to play itself out. But, kind of just decoupling some of the things we're doing to promote, fit, and I would say just the performance and connectivity. For example, we'll be doing additional things all around communication, right? Because as Khalid said, authenticity, right? And the ability to communicate. And one of the challenges in a virtual world, I mean, look, it's a challenge when you're in person, but it's probably heightened, right? Is communication and clarity, right? And moving quickly and typing fast emails and just, how that's interpreted, or text messages, and how that could put things in a tailspin and so forth. And so I'm really focused on bringing resources to my team, whether it's kind of improv classes all around radical candor, or just really being very deliberate about providing tools and creating, virtual groups and sessions around communication and, what is okay and how we can communicate with one another, and not to overlook kind of simple things that derail day to day. So that's something that's, I think, really critical in order to continue to maintain this momentum, particularly as now we move into hybrid, right? Where everyone isn't all hybrid or all remote all the time, or all in the office, right? And so communication is so critical in the context of culture, in the context of productivity, in the context of trust. And so we're putting a lot of effort. I'm doing a lot with my team moving forward to really provide the tools for everyone, right? To level set, how we're talking to each other, how we're interpreting things, and so forth, because that to me is really critical in this next phase.
I'm just making a note to our producer, Melissa. I think we definitely need improv classes to add that to our list. Okay. Mike, any thoughts on this area?
Yeah, just it's amazing, I think, how aligned we are. We're living in parallel lives. As a remote company and as consultants, we have to have hard conversations with our customers all the time about scope and what we think about what you're doing, right? And so for a very long time, all our employees have been given a book called Crucial Conversations. And if you don't know that book, I'd recommend it. It's good. But as a result of the pandemic and about being fully virtual and not being able to get together, and like someone said about the social justice issues that came up this past year, we have been even more intentional about transparency, because transparency builds trust. And especially if you have a remote team, right, you have to have trust to talk about the hard stuff and stuff that you really need to address to be better as an organization. And so we've rolled out a concept that we call a social covenant. And as an old married guy who has managed to stay married, I've had a lot of training on talking correctly on different conversations. I've got a lot of training from our church as well, but we find some people aren't equipped to have those difficult conversations, whether it's about race or how you're feeling or people's objectivities or their bias. And so we've actually really leaned into this, what we call a social covenant, and it's an instruction book to have some of these difficult conversations around culture, or, how you feel, or bringing your whole self to life and to work. And the last point, I would echo again, very important for your younger people on staff. They really want to have it all out on the table. They want to talk about everything.
Yeah. Oh, so many good points there that I've been taking notes rapidly. We're going to sort of pivot a little bit. And if you all don't mind, I'm going to just shamelessly plug Cmo Huddles for a second. For those who have not heard of Cmo Huddles, it was something we launched in 2020. It's an invitation-only community that brings together an elite group of CMOs to share, care, and dare each other to greatness. One CMO described a huddle as a cross between an expert workshop and a therapy session. Another noted, I've yet to walk away from a huddle without a few great ideas that I can put into practice. Khalid, Ellina, Mike, anything you want to add or share about your experience with CMO Huddles?
Always good. Always take something away.
There it is.
A lot of wisdom in the group.
A lot of wisdom.
Yeah, I think the one thing that it's sort of like a Gartner analyst conversation when you're like, I have this problem. I know these 4 softwares or tools that fix it. What is your experience with each? And that sort of diligence conversation that can happen in 15 minutes would have taken me hours otherwise.
Love that. Saving you hours. All right. Ellina, did you want to say something?
I would just really appreciate the diversity of thought. And the different industries, and kind of echoing both what Mike and Khalid mentioned.
One more point, it's easy to connect with folks that comment on something that's of particular interest to you. So in more than one instance, I've been able to connect with the person via LinkedIn or the CMO Slack channel and said, hey, you said this about your content creation team. Could we have an offline chat about that? And everybody's very generous with their time. So I've learned a lot from other people.
That's awesome. So I'm imagining a scenario like this, and I'm imagining the scenario where you're in the office 3 times a week as a leader, because your management has said you ought to be in the office at least 3 times a week, right? And you have certain members of your team that are there those 3 days. And I'm imagining you're walking into the coffee room and you're having a casual conversation with them, and you might even have lunch with them because you're sitting, you brought your lunch, and you're going to talk about stuff in a way that you won't talk with somebody on Slack or Teams or so forth. And that individual is undoubtedly going to have a competitive advantage. So what are you going to do? How is this going to play out so that for your fully remote workers who never come back in, how are you not going to show favoritism, or does it matter?
I think it's a great point, Drew. I think it does matter. I think you need to be very intentional as a leader in this instance, right? You need to be aware of those quiet, remote voices and give them airtime, and maybe go out of your way to build relationship with them, right? Because you don't want them to be marginalized. Be purposeful about sharing growth assignments with those remote workers. And, I don't know if bias is the right word, but really be aware that you could very much become biased as a result of that in-person FaceTime.
I would jump in and really echo that is you have to be intentional. And of course, that's going to happen in the hybrid environment. You will see people, you will have lunch with them and talk about things. And while you can't, and let's say you're talking about projects with multiple teams, I mean, you can't send notes for every lunch conversation. I completely understand that's unrealistic, but I do really encourage my team as we start to figure out what hybrid means for us. If you are having a sideline conversation, or if you did talk about things at lunch and there's a small project team and 2 of you happen to be in the office, take the 5 minutes to send a note. Take the 5 minutes to send a quick text message. Take the 2 minutes to send something via Teams. It doesn't have to be formal, laborious exercise, but to start to create this habit, right, that you're a team, right? Some of us see each other, some of us are remote on certain days. But if you had some kind of aha, really cool idea, or the nugget of something, or just even a recap with like critical next steps, you have to really take a step back and say, what would make me feel comfortable when it's my remote day, right? And you would want your colleagues to fill you in. And again, I think just something informal and starting to create those small, I feel like everyone is using this term stackable habits, but 30-second recap, send the note, send the Slack message, whatever it is. I think that goes a really long way to building your own habit and also creating inclusion. And then we're really thoughtful, and I'm really kind of deliberate about this with my team, is on project teams, creating co-leadership with kind of people who tend to be in the office and people who are in completely different parts of the country. Because I have a field marketing team, as many of, I'm sure the CMOs tuning in or in your group do. And some people are here in the corporate office in Chicago. And so our project teams that have co-chair opportunities, as much as possible, trying to create co-chairs that somebody's in Chicago and somebody's in California. And that creates an even playing field, right? Because automatically you're bringing people together. And then another great tip is that I heard and that I'm starting to use more is give remote employees, especially when you're in hybrid meetings and you have a number of people in the office joining from a conference room, be deliberate about asking those employees who are remote to actually lead the meeting, right? So you're forced to really kind of not forget screens on the wall. Like the employees who are remote should be the leaders, right? And so again, it creates that level playing field, and it sends a signal that it doesn't matter where you're physically sitting. We are one team, and everyone has an equal role and is equally important in the contribution. And just because 3 of you happen to be in home office today, that's okay. The person whose day is remote is just as critical in this team meeting as any of you, and they're leading.
So stackable habits I hadn't heard, and I love that. I'm going to throw into the mix that we need to be thinking about FOMO fighting, right? This is part of your job description now. Mm-hmm. And then I just wanted to sort of shout out to Khalid, because we talked about that this week in a huddle, that you have a policy that you could share about how you also keep it level when you have remote and people in the office. Can you just share that?
Sure. Yeah. So prior to the pandemic, we've always been sort of a remote first company. And so if we ran a meeting and one person was remote, everyone operated as if they were remote. So we would all do the meeting from Zoom. We would all have a square on the screen. And that worked quite well. I think another thing that's worked well is sort of having personal conversations with people who are remote, building a repertoire with what they're doing over the weekend, or sending them a recipe that you worked on or something like that. So some of the small talk or coffee chat, is not lost on them. And then I think the final point that, relative, I think everyone made really extraordinary points and things that we're certainly thinking about. But the other, and this is a more macro point, is we don't know what we don't know. This is an accelerating trend, and the world has changed more in the last year than it did in the last 10. And so I think that what's really important is marketing, the people team and other sort of components of leadership need to be super deliberate about which data we're collecting and what that data means. And so if we're promoting people or giving comp increases to people who are in the office almost exclusively, we need to be transparent about that. If productivity is really high for sales reps who are in the office and really low for those who are remote or in field marketing teams, et cetera, we need to hire differently. And so, I think that we just have to track everything and revisit on a very regular basis, because everything now feels very hypothetical.
A lot of really good points. I just want to, again, put a punctuation point on. I love the notion of tracking it, not to be big brother, but just to make sure that you're being fair. That's part one of this, right? Is that if you're just promoting people who are in the office and you have a problem, but if you see that your productivity is higher among people who are in the office, and that's a whole nother thing. And now I know, Mike, you were going to say something on this topic. And
yeah, just a couple quick points. Ellina, you made me think of something. Maybe it feels a little profound to me, but I think our bias is to think that remote is bad. If you're remote, that's not as good as in office. But why do we think that way? We could be empowering a lifestyle for a person that's really important, whether they have challenging kids or they're a caregiver. Like, why not just embrace it and say, hey, good for you, you're remote. We're going to do everything as a team to support what you need to do. who doesn't want who doesn't want less traffic on the roads, right? Like, why aren't we all kind of like go remote workers, right? And then last thing, I think we also have to encourage our remote workers. You need to be smart about being remote. You need to show up when there's in-person functions, even if it's hard, right? You need to come to your one-on-one meetings prepared, and you need to build relationship. You need to be the person that's using the back channel to, hey, you said something interesting, I'm so-and-so, let's talk about this, right? You need to be smart about it as well as a remote worker.
Yeah, all great points. Why not? It's funny, as I think about my personal experience, we have one employee, a renegade, who's worked for us for several years now, who started as a digital nomad. I think my first conversation with him was when he was in Java or Krakatoa, right? And he's since moved and has been living in Copenhagen this entire pandemic, and just absolutely one of our most cherished employees. And he's had different jobs, and it has never mattered. And we see him maybe once a year, haven't seen him in a couple. So I think it's a great point, Mike. Now, this is the point in time in the show where I always ask, what would Ben Franklin say? And so thinking about how much many of us have enjoyed working from home, and kind of to your point, Mike, about why are we looking at remote work as bad? I thought this Franklin quote was perfect. I acknowledge that solitude is an agreeable refreshment for a busy mind. And I certainly, as I speak to you from my home studio in New York City, I totally feel sometimes that the solitude that we have has been extraordinarily helpful. So, all right, let's keep going and sort of get to some things we're guessing here, right? We don't know exactly how this is going to go, but the role of the office is going to change. Right? It's going to change dramatically. The way we think about office is going to change. Do you have any thoughts on how you want it to change personally, and what that's going to mean for you as a marketing leader?
I mean, I would like for people to see the office as a positive place where things actually get done. I think if we're saying that people are going to go back when they want to go back, or when they need to have a meeting or a meetup or a collaboration session, and that's 1 or 2 days a week, then I hope that people don't wake up in the morning and they dread going into an office. That it'll truly be the sort of innovation, collaboration, or creativity hub that so many companies have aspired for their offices to be for so long, investing like in slides and chic cafeterias and nap pods. I think, if people go with true purpose, that's sort of the North Star to me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's funny. We heard from one company that was going to, you can do whatever you want, but you only get a desk, an assigned desk, if you're in the office 3 days a week or more. I thought that was an interesting approach. And again, to try to, in some ways, reward the person who comes more, which again is an interesting perspective and goes back to what you were saying, Mike, is why are we even thinking about it that way? But other thoughts on how the notion of office changes?
Franklin was a fascinating guy, right? Your life will be enriched by reading a biography about a guy like Franklin, and really most historical figures. But that aside, the cat's out of the bag on remote work, right? It's possible. It's doable. It can work. And we were forced on it. We were forced into it. But so many companies that we talk with are embracing a hybrid model. And, why not, right? Who doesn't like quality work? We have a lot of employees that have to do a lot of deep thought. They're writing software, they're writing code. And, we have many employees that tell us, hey, I really get a lot done at work. I can be very productive. I can shut everything out and really roll with it. So, I think the smart money is really embracing the hybrid model and using that office time as, great brainstorming time. I know when we go into the Centric facilities that we have, typically they're at WeWork places. It's about a big meeting, a big brainstorming session, a design session, and it's terrifically fun, and people like going in and doing that. But it's also good to have the opposite, where you're not like heads down cranking out quality work.
So one of the things that we've been talking a lot about in Huddles, and I think it has to do with this topic, which is there is tremendous competition for top talent, particularly in marketing departments. Your marketing ops person is getting, your top content person is getting pitched all the time. What role, if any, does Office at this point play in retention or recruiting? I mean, and how are you looking at it? Because I mean, a lot of the conversation has been about, we really don't care about the office because I can recruit from anywhere now. Just curious, as you think about it, in some ways, the notion of office has been somewhat restraining. And this has got to be liberating for you as you think about building a team anywhere in the world.
Case by case basis, right? I mean, and it really depends on the people, kind of why we're having this conversation at all, right? For some people, it's a non-starter. If you're not going to offer whatever they're looking for in this chapter of their life, kind of after 15 months of the pandemic, then you may risk losing them, right? If they believe they can get more flexibility somewhere else. But I think it's, finding the balance. There's high competition for talent. There's also a wealth of talent out there. And so just understanding your business needs, and can some people be truly 100% remote, or do they need to be more hybrid? And then, I also just look for people who are, of course, very talented, but just also flexible, I would say. If people want to be fully remote, look, that's their personal choice, and they will find opportunities to do that. But why is it? Are they just completely inflexible for just general reasons? Because I think, to me, it's hybrid. Of course, this is the crux of the conversation, but the people that will thrive, right, and the people that I would be looking for are just those that are flexible, right, and kind of adapt with whatever is required. And so there's just kind of this combination of what's driving these decisions.
Yeah, I just keep thinking about the Silicon Valley, all these companies that invested so much in office, right? And, the lunch food there, the gyms, the running paths, all of these things that were meant to sort of attract and retain. And now we take that off the shelf. And in some ways, it's leveled the playing field in that your physical structure has nothing to do with your employer brand, or may not. So that puts so much onus on you, I think, the marketer, in sort of, okay, what is the virtual brand? What is the virtual company? Because you don't have the lunchroom and the treadmill and that necessarily you're selling. And do you think about that as we move forward in 2021 and 2022, that suddenly the role of marketing in some ways is probably more important. The role of brand is more important because there's no physical.
Yeah, I think it's really a both and kind of model, Drew. Like, if you think about the activities you do that are really enhanced by having physical space in office, you think of hierarchical kind of tasks where you have senior people mentoring and taking care of more junior people, right? Marketing specialists, coordinators, working with their copywriters and editors or their creative brand staff. Those people need that extra touch, right? There's real power in being able to knock on someone's door and say, hey, I'd really like to, pick your brain about something. And in the other instance, I think, is the highly creative task, and you nailed it with brand, right? Like, our brand team, they love getting together and physically, pressing the flesh and using the whiteboards to come up with the next brand campaign and the next brand idea. And so I think you got to be really intentional again about, like, what are you trying to accomplish in a given day, and when does it really make sense to pull people in? I think the slides and the toys and the ping pong tables and the foosball tables, I think you might see that change, right? As hours in the office are less of a requirement. And so if you're, in the office 50 hours a week or 60 hours a week, do you really need those, those break times as much, right? As a virtual company, we have the foosball tables and the ping pong tables, but they don't get used that much because people aren't in there as much,
right? Yeah, they're not there. All right. Well, we're coming up to the end of the hour, and we do like to end on time. So let's sort of come up with your final words of wisdom for your fellow CMOs on approaching the hybrid workforce. What should their top priorities be?
I think this is where feedback is super important, and not just anecdotally. I mean, listen to employees, survey employees regularly and consistently as things continue to change, but also look at the data. What's happening to productivity as your policies evolve? Are you being fair? And be transparent around both. Say, we're making this decision because here's what we're seeing in the data, and here's what we're hearing from you. And I think that's where companies are going to win. It's not just going to be about their hybrid strategy. It's not going to be about the slide or the foosball table. It might not even be about the mission or the values. It's going to be how authentically they communicate and how transparent they are with employees, especially as things continue to change.
Perfect. Okay. Ellina.
Sure. So I would say be okay not having all the answers or knowing that everything continues to change, and also be okay communicating that and what you may thought have worked and whatever hybrid means, may turn out to be pretty different after all. So I think, again, just kind of being in this change mindset and looking at it as an opportunity, and that, and really, especially in this hybrid model, particularly as we're evolving and kind of coming back and trying it out, communication is super critical, and arming your team with the resources and tools to know how to communicate, especially for your more junior people who are probably still learning and feeling their way out.
Perfect. Okay, Mike, wrap it up.
Work towards a flat organization. Like, let people have access, and be okay with wasting a little time on a call, because you are not going to have those shared car rides to the airport or the time where you're walking to lunch to get to know people. So you have to be okay to let some of that happen in your virtual meetings.
Man, this was such a meaty session. I'm so grateful for the three of you. You're all great sports, and really thank you for summarizing this in such a great way. I mean, it seems like we heard you need to be deliberate about this. You need to be flexible. You need to have a plan and really be thinking about this as something different. Okay. Thank you, audience, for staying with us. Cue the music. Renegade Thinkers Live is produced by Melissa Caffrey. Our intern is Sam White. Our botanical expert is Nicole Hernandez. For show notes and past episodes, please visit renegade.com, home to quite possibly the savviest B2B marketing agency in New York City. I'm your host, Drew Neiser, and until next time, keep those Renegade thinking caps on and strong.